The Odyssey is an ancient Greek epic poem traditionally attributed to Homer, a figure whose life and identity remain subjects of scholarly debate. As one of the two foundational works of Western literature, alongside its companion epic, the Iliad, the Odyssey has exerted profound influence on literary traditions for nearly 3 millennia. The poem recounts the 10-year journey of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, also known by the Latin variant Ulysses, as he attempts to return home following the decade-long Trojan War. This homecoming narrative, or nostos in ancient Greek, forms the central thread of the epic. The composition of the Odyssey is dated by scholars to approximately 725 to 675 BC, during the late 8th or early 7th century BC, though the exact date remains uncertain. The poem originated in Ionia, an ancient Greek colonial region located in Asia Minor, corresponding to modern-day Western Turkey. This geographic context is significant, as Ionia was a major cultural center where Greek oral traditions flourished and evolved into written forms. The Odyssey consists of 12,109 lines, arranged into 24 books or divisions. This 24-book structure, while generally accepted as part of the poem's modern organization, was probably established long after the original composition. Early scholars proposed that the 24 divisions corresponded to the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet, but this theory is widely considered ahistorical. The actual origin of these divisions remains debated, with some scholars suggesting they were authentic components of the oral tradition, while others attribute them to Alexandrian scholars working centuries after Homer's time. According to Pseudo-Plutarch, the divisions may have been created by Aristarchus of Samothrace, though evidence against this attribution exists. Alternative theories connect the segmentation to performance traditions, possibly as organizational tools for rhapsodes, the professional reciters who performed epic poetry at public gatherings. The poem was composed in dactylic hexameter, sometimes called Homeric hexameter, a metrical form with 6 metrical feet per line. Each foot consists of a dactyl, a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. The hexameter used in the Odyssey is catalectic, meaning that the final foot lacks an expected syllable. Individual lines contain between 12 and 17 syllables, and each line generally forms a grammatically complete sentence. This metrical structure was not merely aesthetic, but served practical purposes in oral composition and memorization, allowing bards to maintain rhythm and recall extensive narrative passages during performance. The Odyssey was intended as an oral performance piece rather than a written text for private reading. In ancient Greece, epic poems were performed aloud by skilled reciters at festivals, public gatherings, and aristocratic symposia. The language of the poem is literary and formulaic, employing vocabulary that was likely never the vernacular of any actual Greek population. This artificial literary language combined elements of various Greek dialects, particularly Ionic Greek, creating a specialized poetic register suited to epic composition. The narrative style relies heavily on direct speech, with characters frequently serving as narrators alongside the primary Homeric narrator. This technique makes speech the primary method of characterization and plot advancement. Among the distinctive features of Homeric epic are the extended similes, known as epic similes or Homeric similes. These comparative metaphors draw imagery from the natural world or everyday life and can range from brief to quite lengthy. The similes employ various temporal modes: simple present tense, the epic tense blending past and present, or timeless gnomic structures, and serve multiple functions including characterization and thematic reinforcement. Another characteristic feature is the pervasive use of epithets, descriptive phrases, or compound adjectives attached to characters and objects, such as wine-dark sea or rosy-fingered dawn. These epithets functioned as mnemonic aids for oral performers while adding rhythmic and aesthetic qualities to the verse. The epic begins in medias res, meaning in the middle of things, a narrative technique that has become a defining characteristic of epic poetry. Rather than opening with Odysseus's departure from Troy, the poem commences near the end of his journey with the hero stranded on the island of the nymph Calypso. Earlier events are revealed through retrospective narration and flashbacks, primarily when Odysseus recounts his adventures to the Phaeacians. This sophisticated narrative structure creates dramatic tension and allows Homer to control the flow of information to his audience. The Odyssey exemplifies the genre of epic poetry, defined as an exalted story of a warrior hero's journey involving interactions with gods and supernatural forces, told in formal poetic structure. The hero's actions span multiple geographical settings, from the Mediterranean islands to the underworld. The involvement of the supernatural is pervasive, with gods directly intervening in mortal affairs. Athena serves as Odysseus's divine patron. Poseidon acts as his implacable enemy, and Zeus attempts to maintain neutrality while ultimately influencing outcomes. The narrative perspective is omniscient, with the narrator possessing godlike knowledge of all events, thoughts, and motivations. The poem engages with a pre-existing mythological tradition, assuming audience familiarity with the Trojan War and broader Greek mythology. While both the Iliad and Odyssey reference this shared mythological background, they function as independent narratives, and the order of their composition remains uncertain. The Odyssey does not directly reference specific events depicted in the Iliad's account of the war, suggesting the epics developed along parallel but separate trajectories. This foundational text of Western literature has survived through centuries of transmission, first through oral performance, then through manuscript copying, and eventually through printed editions. The extraordinary length of the poem, over 12,000 lines, means that in the ancient world it may have occupied 24 individual papyrus rolls, a physical manifestation corresponding to its 24-book structure. The transition from oral performance to written text, and questions surrounding Homer's literacy and role in that transition, constitute a major area of scholarly inquiry known as the Homeric question, which continues to generate debate among classical scholars. The Odyssey emerged from a cultural context vastly different from the literate societies familiar to modern audiences. The poem's origins lie in the Greek Dark Ages, a period spanning approximately 1100 to 800 BC, which followed the catastrophic collapse of Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization in the early 12th century. This collapse, known to historians as the Late Bronze Age collapse, saw the disintegration of the wealthy, literate, and highly organized Greek city-states that had dominated the Aegean region. The Mycenaean palaces were destroyed or abandoned. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks dissolved, and populations declined dramatically. What remained was a nearly post-apocalyptic landscape, scattered with the physical remnants of a once great civilization. Temples, palaces, fortifications, and artwork, whose origins and creators became increasingly mysterious to subsequent generations. During the Greek Dark Ages, the populations living among these ruins existed in societies that lacked the complex social hierarchies, advanced technologies, international trade networks, and writing systems that had characterized the Mycenaean world. Crucially, literacy vanished entirely from the Greek world during this period. The linear B syllabary used by Mycenaean scribes for administrative record-keeping was forgotten, and no writing system replaced it for centuries. This absence of writing meant that cultural knowledge, historical memory, and literary traditions could be preserved and transmitted only through oral means. Into this void emerged the oral tradition of epic poetry. Professional singers and bards became the keepers and transmitters of cultural memory. These performers composed and recited long narrative poems celebrating the deeds of heroes, the interventions of gods, and the great conflicts of the legendary past. They did not memorize fixed texts in the manner of modern actors learning scripts. Instead, they employed a sophisticated system of oral, formulaic composition. This technique relied on a vast repertoire of standardized phrases, recurring epithets such as swift-footed Achilles or wine-dark sea, and traditional type scenes that could be deployed flexibly during performance. These formulaic elements served multiple functions. They aided memorization, maintained the required metrical patterns of dactylic hexameter, and allowed bards to improvise variations while preserving the essential narrative structure. The oral tradition was inherently dynamic and evolutionary. As epic poems passed from one generation of bards to the next, they gradually evolved, with individual performers introducing variations, elaborations, or local adaptations. Stories existed not as single fixed versions, but as flexible traditions that could be remodeled by skilled singers. The bard could intentionally transform central characters like Achilles or Odysseus, without fundamentally altering their traditional roles or destined fates. The oral poet possessed techniques to attract and arouse audience attention by building on listeners' knowledge of traditional tales as they existed in the collective memory of society. Every performance of a cyclic song echoed the larger story of the entire Trojan War cycle. Even when depicting only a single episode traditionally extracted from the beginning or end of the macro narrative. The content of these oral epics drew upon collective memories of the Mycenaean Bronze Age, filtered through centuries of oral transmission. The stories commemorated a literate, wealthy society that had collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age, transforming historical events and cultural practices into legend. Archaeological evidence suggests possible historical basis for the Trojan War in conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian populations near the site identified as Troy, though the extent to which the epics reflect actual historical events remains debated. The oral tradition incorporated mythological figures and themes through the presence of gods and goddesses such as Zeus and Athena, supernatural beings, and the use of divine intervention and fate as driving forces in the plot. The epics blended historical and mythological elements by interweaving real-world locations like Ithaca and Troy with mythical stories and characters, creating a semi-legendary past that shaped Greek cultural memory. Epic poetry was performed at public gatherings, religious festivals, aristocratic symposia, and other communal occasions. These performances served not merely as entertainment, but as vehicles for education and cultural preservation. The epics transmitted shared values, emphasizing honor, glory, individual achievement, hospitality, and guest friendship, known as xenia. The Homeric epics played a crucial role in establishing a shared cultural heritage, creating a common set of stories, heroes, and values that promoted a sense of Greekness among the various independent city-states scattered across the Greek world. The transition from purely oral tradition to written text occurred gradually during the 8th century BC, coinciding with the Greek adoption of the Phoenician alphabet and its modification to represent Greek sounds. Someone, or perhaps a group of individuals, known collectively as Homer, compiled and transcribed oral narratives that had circulated for centuries, producing the written text recognized as the Iliad and the Odyssey. This codification likely occurred between 750 and 650 BC, preserving what came to be regarded as the definitive versions of these epics. However, the shift to writing did not immediately end oral tradition. Even after written codification, oral performance and recitation persisted, with ongoing development of local variations and interpretations. Professional reciters called rhapsodes continued to perform the Homeric epics at festivals and competitions for centuries after the poems had been committed to text. The relationship between oral composition and written fixation remains a central question in Homeric scholarship, with debate continuing over whether Homer himself was literate, whether he dictated to scribes, or whether the written texts represent later transcriptions of oral performances. The epic cycle, a collection of other ancient Greek epic poems related to the Trojan War story, further illustrates the breadth of oral tradition. These poems included the Cypria, Aethiopus, Little Iliad, Iliou-Persis, Nostoi, and Telegony. Say that 5 times fast. All composed in the same dactylic hexameter meter as Homer's works. Aristotle, in his Poetics, explicitly distinguished these cyclic epics as inferior to the Iliad and Odyssey, suggesting that even in antiquity, Homer's works were recognized as exceptional achievements. The epic cycle represented the distillation, in literary form, of an oral tradition that had developed during the Greek Dark Ages, based in part on localized hero cults. Unlike the Iliad and Odyssey, which survived in complete form through continuous transmission, the cyclic epics survive only in fragments and summaries from late antiquity and the Byzantine period. The oral tradition from which the Odyssey emerged thus represents a remarkable cultural achievement, the preservation of complex narratives spanning thousands of lines across centuries without the benefit of writing, accomplished through the specialized skills of professional bards and the mnemonic structures embedded in formulaic poetry. Understanding this oral context is essential to appreciating the Odyssey not as a modern literary text composed by a lone author, but as the culmination of generations of oral performance tradition, crystallized in written form during a pivotal moment in Greek cultural history. The question of whether Homer's Odyssey emerged from a purely Greek oral tradition, or whether it was influenced by earlier literary works from the Near East, has occupied scholars for over a century. The most significant potential precursor is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian narrative composed in the Akkadian language that predates Homer's epics by many centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh originated in ancient Sumeria around 2100 BC and was later expanded in Akkadian versions, most notably the Standard Babylonian version, composed around 1300 to 1000 BC. This means the Gilgamesh tradition was already ancient by the time Homer composed his epics, around 700 BC. The Epic of Gilgamesh recounts the adventures of the king of Uruk and his companion Enkidu, followed by Gilgamesh's desperate quest for immortality after Enkidu's death. The narrative structure includes divine encounters, journeys across treacherous waters, meetings with supernatural beings, and ultimately a descent to the underworld realm of the dead. These elements bear striking resemblances to episodes in the Odyssey, particularly in the middle books, where Odysseus recounts his wanderings. Scholars have identified several specific parallels between the two epics. Both narratives feature extended sea voyages undertaken by their protagonists, with Gilgamesh crossing the waters of death to reach Utnapishtim, the faraway, and Odysseus traversing the Mediterranean, encountering various perils. Divine intervention plays a central role in both epics. Gilgamesh receives guidance and assistance from the goddess Shamash and other deities, while Odysseus benefits from Athena's protection and suffers from Poseidon's enmity. Most significantly, both heroes journey to the realm of the dead seeking knowledge. Gilgamesh visits Utnapishtim in his otherworldly dwelling to learn the secret of eternal life, while Odysseus descends to the underworld in Book 11 to consult the prophet Tiresias about his homecoming. The structure parallels become particularly evident when comparing specific sections of the two works. Tablets 9 through 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which detail his journey to find Utnapishtim, correspond thematically to books 5 through 13 of the Odyssey, where Odysseus travels from Calypso's island through various encounters until reaching Ithaca. Both narratives feature encounters with divine or semi-divine females who offer the hero a form of immortality or extended life. Calypso offers Odysseus immortality if he remains with her, while Siduri, the tavern keeper, advises Gilgamesh about the futility of his quest. The motif of sacred or divine livestock appears in both epics. The bull of heaven sent against Gilgamesh by the goddess Ishtar parallels the cattle of the sun god Helios that Odysseus's crew fatally slaughters. Additional thematic similarities include the testing of the hero through supernatural challenges, the importance of wisdom and cunning in addition to physical prowess, and the ultimate acceptance of human mortality and limitations. Both Gilgamesh and Odysseus must confront their own mortality and the boundaries of human existence. Though they respond differently, Gilgamesh fails in his quest for immortality and returns home chastened, while Odysseus rejects immortality with Calypso to return to his mortal wife and kingdom. The question of whether these parallels represent direct influence, indirect cultural transmission, or independent development of universal narrative patterns remains debated among scholars. Some researchers argue for direct influence, suggesting that knowledge of Mesopotamian literature could have reached the Greek world through commercial and cultural contacts in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age or early Iron Age. The Phoenicians, who maintained extensive maritime trade networks connecting Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Greek world, could have served as cultural intermediaries transmitting literary traditions. Greek colonization and mercenary activity in the Near East during the 8th and 7th centuries BC provided additional opportunities for cultural exchange. However, establishing definitive connections remains difficult due to the scarcity of direct evidence. The collapse of Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations around 1200 BC, followed by the Greek Dark Ages, created a documentary void that obscures potential transmission routes. Unlike the Hittites, who demonstrably knew of Mesopotamian literature and incorporated it into their own traditions, no comparable evidence exists for Greek knowledge of Akkadian texts. The Linear B tablets from Mycenaean Greece contain only administrative records, not literary works, leaving no trace of what narrative traditions the Bronze Age Greeks might have possessed. Alternative explanations for the similarities focus on universal narrative patterns and common Indo-European mythological heritage. The hero's journey, quests involving supernatural challenges, underworld descents, and divine intervention appear in the mythologies of many cultures and may represent archetypal narrative structures rather than evidence of direct borrowing. Some scholars suggest that both Greek and Mesopotamian traditions drew upon older, shared Indo-European or Mediterranean mythological motifs, resulting in parallel rather than derivative stories. Other Near Eastern epics and mythological traditions also show potential connections to Homeric epic. The Hittite Song of Release, which features themes of captivity and liberation, has been compared to elements in Homer. Egyptian literature, particularly tales of sea voyages and encounters with supernatural beings, may have contributed to the development of Greek maritime adventure stories. The Ugaritic Baal cycle from Syria, with its divine conflicts and heroic struggles, represents another potential influence on Greek mythology. The formulaic nature of oral epic poetry itself complicates questions of influence. Both Mesopotamian and Greek epic traditions developed over centuries through oral composition and transmission, accumulating stock scenes, repeated phrases, and conventional narrative patterns. Similar storytelling techniques emerged independently in different oral traditions, making it difficult to distinguish shared inheritance from parallel development. Recent scholarship has emphasized cultural hybridity in the ancient Mediterranean, viewing literary traditions not as isolated national products, but as participants in a broader network of cultural exchange. From this perspective, the Odyssey represents not pure Greek invention, but a synthesis of indigenous Greek oral traditions with motifs, themes, and narrative patterns circulating throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world during the early first millennium BC. Whether Homer or his predecessors consciously adapted Near Eastern sources, or whether these influences entered Greek tradition gradually and indirectly through generations of cultural contact, remains uncertain. What remains clear is that the Odyssey emerged not in isolation, but within a rich intercultural context where Greek traditions interacted with the ancient literary heritage of the Near East. Understanding these possible connections enriches appreciation of the epic's place within the broader history of ancient Mediterranean literature, while acknowledging the difficulties of establishing definitive relationships across the gaps of time and lost documentation. The figure known as Homer occupies a peculiar position in literary history. Universally credited with composing two of the most influential works in Western literature, yet shrouded in uncertainty regarding nearly every aspect of his existence. The traditional image depicts a blind poet from Ionia who composed the Iliad and Odyssey sometime during the 8th century BC. However, modern scholarship has subjected this traditional portrait to rigorous scrutiny, generating what classicists term the Homeric question, a complex set of debates concerning authorship, composition methods, and historicity. Ancient Greek tradition itself offered conflicting accounts of Homer's life and origins. 7 different cities claimed to be his birthplace, including Smyrna, Chios, Colophon, and Athens. reflecting widespread desire to claim association with the great poet rather than reliable biographical information. Various ancient sources provided birth dates ranging across several centuries, with estimates spanning from the 12th century BC to as late as the 7th century. These chronological discrepancies suggest that even in antiquity, concrete knowledge about Homer's life had dissolved into legend. The etymology of the name Homer itself presents difficulties and has generated multiple interpretative theories. One proposed derivation connects the name to the ancient Greek word meaning hostage or pledge, though the significance of such a connection remains unclear. An alternative etymology traces the name to a Semitic root meaning to say or to tell, which would be particularly appropriate for an oral poet, though this theory requires explaining how a Semitic term became attached to a Greek figure. Some scholars have suggested that Homer functioned not as a personal name, but as a professional designation or title applied to master poets within a bardic tradition. Related to this latter interpretation is the existence of the Homeridae, a guild or clan whose name translates as Sons of Homer or Sons of Hostages. This group appears to have been a professional association of poets and rhapsodes who claimed descent, whether literal or figurative, from Homer, and who specialized in performing and preserving epic poetry. The Homeridae were particularly associated with the island of Chios, which maintained one of the strongest claims to be Homer's birthplace. The existence of such a professional guild raises the possibility that Homer designated a school or tradition of poetry rather than an individual composer. The Homeric question encompasses several distinct but interrelated problems. First, the question of authorship. Were the Iliad and Odyssey composed by the same individual? Or do they represent the work of different poets working within a common tradition? Internal evidence reveals differences in vocabulary, style, and thematic emphasis, leading some scholars to propose separate authorship. The Iliad focuses on martial conflict, honor, and the tragic dimensions of heroic culture, while the Odyssey emphasizes cleverness, domestic relationships, and the rewards of perseverance. However, these differences might simply reflect the distinct subject matter of each poem, rather than different authors. Second, the problem of composition method. To what extent were these epics products of oral improvisation versus written composition? The groundbreaking work of Milman Parry and Albert Lord in the 20th century demonstrated that the Homeric epics exhibit the distinctive features of oral formulaic composition, repetitive phrases, stock epithets, and traditional type scenes that facilitate extemporaneous performance. This discovery revolutionized Homeric scholarship by showing that the epics emerged from an oral tradition extending back generations before Homer. Whether Homer himself was literate, whether he dictated to scribes, or whether the written texts represent later transcriptions of oral performances remains contested. Third, the issue of historicity. Did Homer exist as an actual person? Or does the name represent a convenient attribution for anonymous traditional poetry? The complete absence of contemporary documentation regarding Homer's life combined with the clearly legendary nature of later biographical traditions, has led some scholars to adopt skeptical positions. However, the majority view holds that behind the name stands an actual individual or individuals who played decisive roles in giving the Iliad and Odyssey their final forms. However, the majority view holds that behind the name stands an actual person or people who played decisive roles in giving the Iliad and Odyssey their final forms. Current scholarly consensus places the crystallization of the Homeric epics into something resembling their preserved forms between about 750 and 650 BC, during what historians designate the archaic period of Greek history. This dating relies on multiple lines of evidence, including linguistic analysis, historical references within the poems, and the earliest material evidence for the epic's existence. However, this consensus date refers to the moment when the epics achieved written fixation, not necessarily when all their component stories originated. The tales themselves clearly drew upon much older oral traditions, extending back through the Greek Dark Ages to the Mycenaean Bronze Age. The Greek Dark Ages, spanning roughly 1150 to 800 BC, formed the crucible in which the Homeric epics developed. This period began with the catastrophic collapse of Mycenaean palace civilizations around 1200 BC, when major centers including Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were destroyed through a combination of natural disasters, economic disruption, and violent conflict. The subsequent centuries witnessed dramatic population decline, the abandonment of most major settlements, excepting Athens, the complete loss of literacy, and regression to a predominantly pastoral existence with minimal evidence of cultural production. Yet even as material culture declined, oral traditions preserved memories of the vanished Bronze Age world. The tales that would eventually coalesce into the Iliad and Odyssey circulated amongst small, semi-nomadic communities, passed down through generations of bards who kept alive idealized reminiscences of the palace cultures and warrior kings who had ruled centuries earlier. The Homeric epics thus reflect a complex temporal layering, composed in the 8th century, describing events set in the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, and incorporating elements that accumulated during the intervening Dark Age centuries. Homer's position historically separates him from his subject matter by approximately 4 to 5 centuries, a temporal gap roughly equivalent to the distance between modern society and the Pilgrim's landing on Plymouth Rock. This chronological remove explains why the epics blend anachronistic elements from different periods. Bronze Age palace structures and boar's tusk helmets appear alongside Iron Age weapons and social customs. The poems present not historically accurate descriptions, but rather mythologized reconstructions of a legendary past, shaped by centuries of oral transmission and colored by the concerns of successive generations. The relationship between Homer and the broader epic cycle adds another dimension to questions of identity and authorship. The epic cycle comprised numerous poems totaling tens of thousands of lines, composed by various poets and collectively narrating the entire saga of the Trojan War from its mythological origins through its final consequences. Among this extensive corpus, only the Iliad and Odyssey survived intact, suggesting these works possessed exceptional qualities that led to their preservation and canonization. Ancient critics like Aristotle recognized the superiority of Homer's compositions compared to the cyclic epics, praising their focused narrative structure and artistic coherence. Ultimately, the Homeric question may never receive definitive resolution, given the paucity of evidence surviving from the archaic period. What remains certain is that during the 8th century BC, as Greece emerged from the Dark Ages and began developing the alphabet, re-establishing widespread trade networks, and founding colonies throughout the Mediterranean, someone or some group crystallized centuries of oral tradition into the monumental text recognized as the Iliad and Odyssey. Whether this achievement belongs to a single blind poet from Ionia, to multiple contributors within a professional guild, or to a succession of master singers remains unknowable, but the name Homer has become permanently attached to these foundational works of Western literature. The Iliad stands as the companion epic to the Odyssey, both works attributed to Homer and composed during roughly the same period around 700 BC. While scholars debate which poem came first, the two epics occupy complementary positions within Greek literary tradition, with the Iliad providing essential background for understanding the Odyssey's narrative. The Iliad consists of 15,693 lines, arranged into 24 divisions, composed in the same dactylic hexameter meter that characterizes all Greek epic poetry. Like its companion work, the poem represents the culmination of centuries of oral tradition that preserved memories of the Mycenaean Bronze Age through the intervening Dark Ages. The poem's title derives from Ilion, the Greek name for Troy, and the work focuses on a brief but crucial period during the decade-long siege of that city by a coalition of Greek forces. Rather than narrating the entire conflict, the Iliad concentrates on approximately 50 days during the war's 10th and final year. This narrow temporal focus allows Homer to explore his themes with dramatic intensity, building toward the climactic death of Hector, the Trojan prince and Troy's greatest defender. The epic begins with the famous opening word, Manus, meaning wrath or rage, immediately establishing the poem's central concern with Achilles' destructive anger. The narrative commences with a quarrel between Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, and Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces. When Agamemnon is forced to return his war prize, a captive woman named Chryseis, to appease the god Apollo, he compensates himself by seizing Briseis, who had been awarded to Achilles. This public humiliation drives Achilles to withdraw from combat, taking his contingent of Myrmidons with him. The consequences of this withdrawal reverberate throughout the epic. Without Achilles, the Greeks suffer devastating losses, and the Trojans push them back to their beached ships. Only when Achilles' beloved companion Patroclus is killed by Hector does Achilles return to battle. Consumed by grief and vengeance, the poem reaches its emotional apex with Achilles' brutal slaying of Hector and concludes with the funeral rites for both Patroclus and Hector. Thematically, the Iliad differs substantially from the Odyssey. where the Odyssey emphasizes homecoming, family reunion, and the triumph of cunning and intelligence, the Iliad explores the tragedy inherent in the heroic code itself. Central to the poem is the concept of kleos, meaning glory or renown, which Greek warriors sought to achieve through martial excellence. Achilles epitomizes this pursuit, faced with the prophecy that he can either live a long, obscure life or die young with eternal fame. He chooses the latter. Yet Homer subjects this heroic ideal to devastating critique, showing how the pursuit of honor generates cycles of violence, grief, and destruction. Pride, particularly the excessive pride known as hubris, functions as another dominant theme. Agamemnon's arrogant seizure of Briseis triggers the entire crisis, while Achilles' wrathful withdrawal values personal honor above the welfare of his comrades. The poem demonstrates how individual pride magnifies into collective catastrophe, as thousands die because two men cannot reconcile their wounded egos. Even after killing Hector, Achilles continues to defile the corpse, dragging it behind his chariot, an act of excessive vengeance that horrifies even the gods. The theme of fate permeates the epic, with characters operating within predetermined destinies they cannot escape. Both Greeks and Trojans know Troy is doomed, yet they continue fighting. Hector understands he will die, but chooses to face Achilles rather than retreat behind Troy's walls. This tension between foreknowledge and action creates the poem's tragic dimension. Characters make meaningful choices, even within the constraints of inescapable fate. Unlike the Odyssey, where divine intervention tends toward the subtle and indirect, the gods in the Iliad participate actively and visibly in mortal affairs. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, and other Olympian deities take sides in the conflict, directly entering battles, deflecting spears, and even suffering wounds. The divine realm mirrors the mortal world, with gods quarreling, forming alliances, and pursuing vendettas that play out through their human favorites. This divine involvement raises questions about human agency and responsibility that Homer explores throughout the poem. The relationship between the two epics extends beyond thematic contrasts to structural complementarity. Aristotle, in his Poetics, observed that the Iliad possesses a simple linear plot structure focused on passion and suffering, while the Odyssey employs a complex plot with multiple recognitions and reversals. The Iliad concentrates action within a confined geographical space around Troy, while the Odyssey ranges across the Mediterranean. War dominates the Iliad. Battles, duels, tactical maneuvers, and military councils fill its verses, whereas the Odyssey emphasizes travel, exploration, and domesticity. Odysseus himself appears in the Iliad. Homer portrays him as a skilled warrior, but emphasizes particularly his role as counselor and strategist. When Achilles attempts to feign madness to avoid joining the expedition, Palamedes exposes the ruse by placing Odysseus's infant son Telemachus before his plow, forcing the hero to reveal his sanity by swerving aside. Throughout the Iliad, Odysseus functions as a voice of pragmatic wisdom, attempting to mediate conflicts and devise solutions to tactical problems. His greatest contribution, the stratagem, of the wooden horse that ultimately conquers Troy occurs after the Iliad's conclusion, though it is recounted retrospectively in the Odyssey. The historical context underlying the Iliad presents complex interpretative challenges. Traditional chronology places the Trojan War around 1200 BC, coinciding with the end of the Bronze Age and the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. A series of catastrophic upheavals struck the eastern Mediterranean during this period, destroying cities throughout Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. The Hittite Empire collapsed entirely, while Egyptian records describe invasions by mysterious sea peoples. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread destruction at Troy around this period, lending credence to traditions of a historical conflict. However, Homer composed the Iliad approximately 5 centuries after these events, during the Archaic period around 700 BC. This temporal separation means the poem blends authentic Bronze Age memories with anachronistic elements from intervening centuries. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals this layering. The poem describes Bronze Age palace structures, 4 tusk helmets documented in Mycenaean artifacts, and geopolitical relationships confirmed in Hittite archives, yet simultaneously depicts iron weapons and social customs characteristic of Homer's own era. The Hittite records mention a king of Ahiyawa, linguistically equivalent to Homer's Achaeans, as one of the great powers, supporting the existence of a unified Mycenaean kingdom capable of launching the expedition Homer describes. The attack on Troy and the earlier assault on Thebes both appear to have been historical events embedded within the Bronze Age collapse. These conflicts became legendary among subsequent Greek populations living amidst the ruins of Mycenaean grandeur, evolving through oral transmission into the mythological narratives preserved in the epic cycle. The Iliad and Odyssey represent the most artistically accomplished survivors of this extensive poetic corpus, distinguished by their narrative sophistication and thematic depth. Both epics employ Homeric Greek, an artificial literary dialect that never served as anyone's spoken language. This poetic register combines primarily Ionic forms with Aeolic elements and occasional Atticisms, creating a specialized medium suited to epic composition. Professional performers called rhapsodes recited the epics at religious festivals, particularly the Pan-Athenaea in Athens, where competitions tested performers' skill and memory. These public recitations served educational and communal functions, transmitting shared cultural values and establishing common reference points for Greek identity across the fragmented city-state system. The epic cycle, of which both epics formed part, originally encompassed numerous other poems narrating the complete Trojan War saga from its mythological origins through its final days. Works including the aforementioned Cypria, Aethiopis, Little Iliad, and Nostoi filled gaps in the story, describing events before, during, and after those Homer selected for his focused narratives. These cyclic poems survive only in fragments and later summaries, while the Iliad and Odyssey alone achieved canonical status and continuous transmission. Ancient critics recognize the superior artistry distinguishing Homer's compositions from other cyclic epics, praising particularly the Iliad's unified structure, despite its incorporation of traditional materials. Understanding the Iliad provides essential context for appreciating the Odyssey. The 10-year war serves as a catalyst for Odysseus's subsequent 10-year journey, and many episodes in the Odyssey reference or presuppose knowledge of Iliadic events. Characters in the Odyssey frequently recall the war, comparing present struggles to past glories. The two poems together offer complementary perspectives on Greek heroic culture, one examining its tragic contradictions through the lens of warfare, the other exploring its domestic dimensions through the journey home. The Odyssey recounts the protracted homeward voyage of Odysseus, king of the island of Ithaca, following the conclusion of the Trojan War. While the conflict itself lasted 10 years, Odysseus's return journey consumes an additional decade, making his total absence from home span 20 years. This extended absence establishes the fundamental tension driving the narrative. The hero's desperate desire to reunite with his family and reclaim his kingdom, but constantly thwarted by divine opposition, natural hazards, and his own crew's failures. Odysseus emerges as a distinctly different heroic type compared to the martial champions celebrated in the Iliad. Rather than privileging raw physical prowess or seeking battlefield glory through aggressive combat, he relies primarily on mental acuity, verbal persuasiveness, and strategic deception. His defining attribute is metis, a Greek concept encompassing cunning, intelligence, practical wisdom, and adaptability. Ancient epithets attached to his name: polytropos, of many turns, or versatile; polymechanos, of many devices, resourceful; and polymedes, of many counsels, or crafty, emphasize these intellectual qualities rather than martial ferocity. This characterization represents a deliberate inversion of traditional heroic values. Where Achilles in the Iliad chooses brief life with eternal fame over long life in obscurity, Odysseus consistently prioritizes survival and homecoming over the pursuit of immortal renown. When the nymph Calypso offers him immortality and eternal youth if he remains as her consort, he declines, preferring mortality with his aging wife Penelope to godhood without his family. This rejection of transcendent glory in favor of domestic restoration marks a fundamental shift in heroic ideology. The narrative unfolds through a sophisticated non-linear structure. Rather than beginning with Odysseus's departure from Troy, the poem opens on Ithaca during the hero's final year of absence, with his household besieged by suitors seeking to marry Penelope and claim the throne. Simultaneously, the scene shifts to Calypso's remote island, where Odysseus has been detained for 7 years. Only later, when Odysseus reaches the court of the Phaeacians, does he narrate his earlier adventures in an extended first-person flashback comprising 4 entire books. This retrospective technique allows Homer to withhold crucial information, creating suspense while providing audiences with multiple narrative perspectives. Only later, when Odysseus reaches the court of the Phaeacians, does he narrate his earlier adventures in an extended first-person flashback comprising 4 entire books. The adventures Odysseus recounts to the Phaeacian court form the poem's most famous episodes. After departing Troy, his fleet first raids the Cicones, then encounters the Lotus Eaters, whose narcotic fruit induces forgetfulness and destroys the desire for home. The confrontation with Polyphemus the Cyclops demonstrates both Odysseus's cleverness and his fatal flaw. Having blinded the monster and escaped, he cannot resist revealing his true name, enabling Polyphemus to invoke his father Poseidon's curse. This curse becomes the primary divine obstacle preventing Odysseus's return. Subsequent encounters escalate in supernatural intensity. The sorceress Circe transforms half his crew into swine before becoming his lover and advisor. Following her counsel, Odysseus journeys to the realm of the dead to consult the shade of the prophet Tiresias about his path home. This Nekia, or underworld visit, allows him to meet the spirits of deceased companions, including Achilles and Agamemnon, who offer contrasting perspectives on death and heroism. Achilles famously declares he would rather be a living slave than a dead king, suggesting the hollowness of posthumous glory. The sirens, whose enchanting songs lure sailors to destruction, test Odysseus's ability to experience danger without succumbing to it. He has himself bound to the mast, while his crew's ears are plugged with wax, allowing him alone to hear their music and survive. The narrow strait guarded by the 6-headed monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis forces him to choose between losing 6 men or risking his entire ship, demonstrating the impossible decisions leaders must make. Finally, his crew's slaughter of the cattle sacred to the sun god Helios, despite explicit warnings, brings Zeus's thunderbolt, destroying the ship and killing all hands except Odysseus. Parallel to Odysseus's wanderings, the poem traces Telemachus's maturation from passive youth to active prince. The opening books follow Telemachus as he confronts the suitors consuming his household's resources and court his mother, then embarks on a journey to Pylos and Sparta, seeking news of his father. These visits to Nestor and Menelaus provide contrasting models of successful homecoming, as both heroes return safely from Troy and re-establish their households. Telemachus's journey constitutes a coming-of-age narrative, transforming him from an ineffectual boy into a worthy heir, capable of standing beside his father. Penelope emerges as one of Greek literature's most complex female characters. For 3 years she has delayed the suitors through her famous stratagem, claiming she must complete weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes, before remarrying. She weaves by day and secretly unravels her work by night. This deception demonstrates intelligence rivaling her husband's, establishing their intellectual compatibility. Her final test for Odysseus, demanding that someone move their marriage bed, knowing he constructed it immovably around a living olive tree, confirms his identity while proving her own constancy. The theme of xenia, or guest friendship, pervades the narrative. Proper hospitality involves offering strangers food, shelter, and gifts before even inquiring their identity, establishing reciprocal obligations between host and guest. Characters who honor Xenia, like the Phaeacians, who provide Odysseus transport home, prosper, while those who violate it, like the Cyclops who devours guests, or the suitors who abuse Odysseus's household, face destruction. This social code reflects the interconnected nature of ancient Mediterranean communities, where travelers depended on the willingness of strangers to provide protection. Divine agencies shape the hero's fate throughout his journey. Athena serves as Odysseus's patron deity, repeatedly intervening to assist him through supernatural means, disguising him as a beggar upon his return to Ithaca, inspiring Telemachus to search for his father, and advocating before Zeus for Odysseus's release from Calypso. Poseidon pursues an implacable vendetta for the blinding of his son Polyphemus, destroying Odysseus's ships and prolonging his suffering. Zeus maintains relative neutrality while ultimately facilitating the hero's restoration. Disguise and recognition constitute major structural elements. Odysseus returns to Ithaca disguised as a beggar, testing his household's loyalty before revealing his identity. A series of carefully orchestrated recognitions follows. First, his old nurse, Euryclea, recognizes him by a scar on his leg. Then his son Telemachus, his faithful swineherd Eumaeus, and cowherd Philetius, and finally, after the slaughter of the suitors, Penelope herself. These staged revelations create dramatic tension while exploring questions of identity. What makes someone recognizable after 20 years of absence and transformation? The climactic slaughter of the suitors occupies the poem's penultimate book. Penelope, at Athena's prompting, announces she will marry whichever man can string Odysseus's massive bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. When all the suitors fail, Odysseus, still disguised, accomplishes the feat, then turns the bow on the suitors, killing them all with Telemachus's assistance. This violent purgation restores order to the disrupted household, though it raises ethical questions about the appropriateness of such wholesale slaughter. The poem concludes with Odysseus's reunion with his aged father Laertes, and the establishment of peace between Odysseus and the suitors' families, mediated by Athena's intervention. This resolution emphasizes reconciliation and the restoration of social order rather than continuing cycles of vengeance. Unlike the Iliad, which ends with Hector's funeral but leaves Troy's destruction and Achilles' death beyond its narrative scope, the Odyssey achieves narrative closure, with the hero successfully reintegrated into his family and kingdom. The journey of the Odyssey, from oral performance to the modern printed editions found in libraries and classrooms, spans nearly 3 millennia, involving numerous transformations and presenting significant challenges to scholars. Understanding this transmission history reveals how the epic survived periods of political upheaval, cultural transition, and technological revolution. The initial transition from oral tradition to written form occurred sometime during the Archaic period, with scholarly consensus placing this crystallization around 700 BC. The exact circumstances surrounding this transcription remain contested. One prominent theory, based partly on remarks by ancient authors including Cicero, suggests that the first authoritative written texts were compiled in the late 500s BC under the Athenian ruler Pisistratos. He sought to establish recitation of the epics as a central component of the Pan-Athenaea, a grand civic festival celebrating Athena. Some scholars point to a minor character in the Odyssey named Pisistratos as potential evidence of this connection, an ingratiating acknowledgement of the festival's sponsor, though this interpretation remains speculative. These public festivals, along with religious ceremonies, funeral games, and pan-Hellenic gatherings, such as the quadrennial Olympic competitions, served as crucial venues for epic performances throughout the Archaic period and beyond. Professional performers, or rhapsodes, a term likely derived from the Greek verb meaning to stitch together, recited the epics at these occasions. The etymology suggests their method of composition, piecing together inherited mythological and folkloric material, traditional verses and formulas, into coherent performances. These public recitations differed markedly from the intimate courtly performances depicted within the epics themselves, serving broader social functions in disseminating shared cultural values across the fragmented Greek world. By the mid-6th century BC, the Iliad and Odyssey had achieved canonical status within Greek literature. This canonization meant the poems were recognized as foundational texts, worthy of preservation, study, and continued performance. However, the texts at this stage remained fluid, with variations existing across different performance traditions and regional contexts. A critical turning point in textual stabilization occurred during the Hellenistic period in Alexandria, Egypt. The Great Library of Alexandria, established in the 3rd century BC, became the center of textual scholarship in the ancient Mediterranean world. Alexandrian scholars undertook systematic critical work on Homeric texts during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. These scholars compared multiple manuscript versions, identified interpolations and corruptions, with explanatory commentary. Aristarchus, in particular, gained fame for his meticulous textual criticism, marking lines he considered spurious. The work of Alexandrian scholars was transmitted to subsequent generations through the writings of later commentators. Their critical observations and textual emendations were preserved as scholia, marginal annotations and commentary written alongside the main text in later manuscripts. These scholia represent an invaluable resource for understanding ancient approaches to the text and preserving scholarly debates that might otherwise have been lost. The earliest surviving physical evidence for the Odyssey comes from papyrus fragments discovered in Egypt. The oldest Homeric papyri date from the 3rd century BC, roughly contemporary with the Alexandrian scholarly editions. Over the centuries, more than 1,000 papyrus fragments containing portions of Homer's works have been recovered from Egyptian sites, with significantly more preserving the Iliad than the Odyssey. These papyri provide crucial witnesses to textual variants predating the medieval manuscript tradition. The relatively stable Alexandrian text became the basis for subsequent manuscript copies, produced by scribes over the following centuries. However, the process of manual copying inevitably introduced variations through transcription errors, deliberate editorial changes, and differences in source manuscripts. Sorting out relationships among surviving texts remains challenging due to these accumulated variations. As the Roman Empire succeeded the Hellenistic kingdoms, knowledge of Greek and Greek literature persisted in the eastern Mediterranean, but declined dramatically in the western provinces. In the West, where Greek literacy became increasingly rare, Latin summaries and adaptations provided the primary means of accessing Homeric material. The Ilias Latina, a Latin abridgment of the Iliad, produced during the 1st century AD, circulated widely in medieval Western Europe, alongside other accounts of the Trojan War of questionable authenticity. The earliest known translation of the Odyssey into any language was Livius Andronicus's Latin Odyssea, produced in the 3rd century BC. Only fragments survive, but this work holds historical significance as one of the first Latin literary texts and played a foundational role in establishing Latin literary tradition. Livius changed the meter from dactylic hexameter to Saturnian verse, likely to increase accessibility for Roman audiences. He rendered the opening invocation to the Muses as an invitation to the Kamene, Roman poetic deities, demonstrating the adaptation necessary for cultural translation. Following the collapse of classical civilization and the division of the Roman Empire, the Odyssey faced potential disappearance during what modern historians term the literary hiatus of late antiquity. The text survived primarily in the Byzantine Empire, where Greek remained the language of culture and administration. Byzantine scholars preserved the epic as part of their Greek literary heritage, producing manuscript copies that maintain continuity with the ancient tradition. Approximately 300 medieval manuscripts of the Iliad or Odyssey survive today, dating from the 9th through the 15th centuries. Interest in Homeric texts flourished particularly in the Byzantine East, where manuscripts produced between the 12th century and the fall of Constantinople in 1453 preserve important scholarship. These Byzantine manuscripts contain not only the epic text, but also extensive scholia, drawing on ancient commentaries, making them invaluable for understanding how earlier generations interpreted Homer. During the medieval period, translations were produced into Georgian and possibly Syriac, though Homer was notably excluded from the extensive Greek to Arabic translation movement that transmitted other classical works to the Islamic world. This exclusion may reflect cultural and religious considerations that made pagan mythological narratives less appealing to Islamic scholars than philosophical or scientific texts. The Renaissance witnessed renewed Western European interest in Greek literature, driven by the arrival of Greek scholars fleeing Constantinople after its fall to the Ottoman Turks. Humanist scholars worked on new Latin translations and prepared the first printed editions. The first printed edition of the Greek text appeared in Florence in 1488, initiating the age of Homeric print transmission. The earliest known translation into any post-classical European vernacular appears to be Simon Schadenreiser's German version, published in 1537. The invention of printing transformed textual transmission, by enabling mass production of relatively standardized texts. However, print did not immediately resolve textual questions. Early printed editions relied on whichever manuscripts editors could access, and different editions reflected different manuscript traditions. Scholarly debate continued, and continues today, about which readings best represent the original composition, or whether such an original meaningfully exists for works emerging from oral tradition. Modern critical editions incorporate evidence from multiple sources: medieval manuscripts, ancient papyri, quotations in other ancient authors, and ancient scholia. The standard scholarly editions attempt to reconstruct an original text while acknowledging the impossibility of absolute certainty, given the epic's complex compositional and transmission history. Martin L. West's edition of the Odyssey, published in the late 20th century, exemplifies this approach by incorporating papyrus readings alongside manuscript evidence, though some scholars criticize it as reflecting overly personal editorial theories rather than consensus scholarly positions. The long transmission history demonstrates remarkable continuity despite numerous opportunities for the text's disappearance. From oral performance in archaic Greece, through Hellenistic scholarship, Roman adaptation, Byzantine preservation, medieval manuscript copying, Renaissance rediscovery, and modern critical editing, the Odyssey has survived as a living text, continuously engaging successive generations of readers, performers, scholars, and translators. The Odyssey has been named literature's most enduring narrative by experts polled by BBC Culture, a testament to its continued resonance nearly 3 millennia after composition. This extraordinary longevity stems from the epic's engagement with fundamental human experiences that transcend historical periods and cultural boundaries. At its core, the poem celebrates values that remain central to human fulfillment: family bonds, the importance of home, hospitality towards strangers, and the peaceful pleasures of communal life. The organizing principle of return, the protagonist's struggle to reunite with family after prolonged separation, speaks to universal yearnings for belonging and connection. Odysseus's rejection of immortality with Calypso in favor of mortal life with Penelope affirms the primacy of human relationships over transcendent but solitary existence. The epic's psychological depth allows successive generations to find contemporary relevance in ancient narratives. Modern psychologists have interpreted Odysseus's journey as metaphor for challenges facing combat veterans returning from war. The epic's psychological depth allows successive generations to find contemporary relevance in ancient narratives. Joseph Campbell's influential work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, identified the Odyssey as a prime exemplar of the monomyth, the archetypal hero's journey involving departure from the ordinary world, initiation through trials, transformation, and return home with newfound wisdom. Campbell's framework, which traces stages including the call to adventure, supernatural aid, threshold crossing, tests and ordeals, apotheosis, and the ultimate boon, maps precisely onto Odysseus's voyage, making the epic a foundational text for understanding narrative patterns that recur across cultures and time periods. George Lucas acknowledged that Campbell's work proved essential to shaping Star Wars, particularly A New Hope, stating that after struggling through early drafts, the hero with 1,000 faces provided the structure that organized his ideas into coherent form, later calling Campbell "my Yoda." Lucas's application of Campbell's monomyth to create a modern space mythology demonstrates the Odyssey's continued influence on contemporary storytelling, as the ancient hero's journey pattern underlies one of the most commercially successful film franchises in history. Modern psychologists have interpreted Odysseus's journey as metaphor for challenges facing combat veterans returning from war. The Lotus Eaters representing substance abuse, the Laestrygonians symbolizing post-traumatic stress, the entire voyage mapping the difficult psychological transition from battlefield to domestic life. The poem's exploration of identity, transformation, and recognition after prolonged absence resonates with anyone who has experienced displacement or struggled to reintegrate into familiar environments after life-changing experiences. The narrative structure itself, with its non-linear timeline, unreliable narrators, and competing accounts of events, anticipates modernist literary techniques while raising timeless questions about myth, memory, and storytelling. The Odyssey asks audiences to consider the nature of narrative itself, as lies, exaggerations, and competing versions vie for acceptance. This reflexive quality gives the work continued vitality as each generation discovers new interpretive possibilities. 21st century popular culture continues mining the epic for inspiration across diverse media. Margaret Atwood's The Penelopead retells the story from Penelope's perspective, part of a broader movement recovering marginalized voices from classical texts. Madeline Miller's Circe transforms a minor antagonist into a complex protagonist, demonstrating the epic's capacity to generate entirely new narratives from its components. Video games, including Assassin's Creed Odyssey, allow interactive engagement with ancient Greek settings and mythological encounters, translating narrative into participatory experience. The TV series Lost structured its entire 6-season arc around Odyssean themes of mysterious island encounters, transformative journeys, and the struggle to return home. The release of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, with its massive budget, IMAX production values, and unprecedented advance ticket sales, demonstrates that nearly 3,000 years after composition, Homer's epic retains sufficient cultural authority to justify Hollywood's largest investments. This continued commercial viability reflects more than simple name recognition. It indicates that audiences still respond emotionally to the story's fundamental concerns. The Iliad and Odyssey together formed the foundation of education throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, establishing a curricular model adopted by Western humanists that persisted for centuries. The Alexandrian scholarship that analyzed these texts laid the foundation for European literacy and philological studies, establishing methodologies that shaped textual criticism across disciplines. The poems mark the beginning of the Western literary tradition and possess, in the assessment of scholars, unrivaled influence on subsequent writing. Yet the epic's significance extends beyond its historical position as a foundational text. Its themes remain perpetually relevant to human experience. the tension between adventure and domesticity, loyalty tested by separation, the moral complexities of revenge, the possibility of renewal after catastrophic loss. These concerns are not artifacts of Bronze Age Greek culture, but permanent features of human existence, ensuring that each generation finds the Odyssey speaks directly to their circumstances. The poem has reverberated across more than a millennium of writing, inspiring countless adaptations, reinterpretations, and responses. Its influence pervades both high literary culture and popular entertainment, from James Joyce's modernist masterpiece to contemporary genre fiction. The epic's narrative patterns, particularly the hero's journey structure, have become so embedded in storytelling conventions that audiences recognize Odyssean elements without necessarily identifying their source. Ultimately, the Odyssey endures because it offers what literature uniquely provides: profound engagement with the fundamental questions of human existence rendered through compelling narrative. Its status as more than historical artifact, but rather as living text, continuously engaging new readers and inspiring new creations, testifies to the power of myth and the universality of its concerns. The journey from oral performance in archaic Greece to global multimedia phenomenon demonstrates not merely cultural preservation, but active transformation, as each era discovers fresh meanings while maintaining continuity with nearly 3,000 years of interpretation. This dynamic relationship between text and contemporary audience ensures the Odyssey will continue shaping human imagination for generations yet to come.